Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Kris. This is How Did Russia Become an Empire? This will be episode, what are we at? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we're going to do 8 and a 9er. And we're going to start right now.
No sooner had he learned of the Saxon advance, he assembled his army and began marching towards the order. After discovering the movements of both Schulenburg and Browser, Reinschild deduced that the two of them planned to avoid open battle with him and join forces at Poznan. To avoid any surprises, the Swedish commander retreated the same way from which he came, and made sure to spread the word at every town and village that he was retreating, and hoping to avoid open battle. Reinschild's information warfare proved successful, as Schulenburg gave credit to the rumors of a Swedish retreat, and decided to pursue the Swedish army instead of advancing towards Poznan. The Saxon general believed that the mere presence of his superior army would be enough to rout the Swedish force. With this strategy, Reinschild achieved two things. He drew Schulenburg's army away from any allied forces, and was able to choose a site of battle that was optimal for the Swedish army's size and composition. Upon both armies reaching the Fraustadt on the 13th of February, Reinschild started arraying his army in battle formation. It was at this point that Schulenburg realized that he had been deceived. However, he had to give battle, as it would have been scandalous for him to retreat with such a superior force. The Saxon force was around 20,000 strong, with around 10,000 Saxon and 6,000 Russian infantry, and 4,000 Saxon cavalrymen. Schulenburg assembled his infantry into two columns, between the villages of Jägersdorf and Rösdorf, and in front of it he placed 31 cannons, 44 mortars, and a chevaux de frise. 2,000 Saxon horsemen were placed on either wing. Reinschild had only 9,400 men at his disposal, with 3,700 infantry and 5,700 cavalry. He placed his cavalry on the flanks, and the majority of his infantry in a single line in the centre, while some Caroleans were also mixed in among the cavalry. Axel Sparre commanded the infantry in the centre, while Hummerhjelm led the left, and Reinschild himself was in charge of the right.
Okay, I know it's scandalous, but you don't have near the numbers you need to even fight. Why do it? Who cares?
As the Swedish army advanced, the Saxons waited until their enemies were at about 100 paces distance, then they fired all of their cannons and mortars. Although the Swedish army suffered some casualties during this barrage, they did not give the Saxons enough time for another one, as the centre and left started their charge. The Swedish centre's advance was at first checked by the chevaux de frise. However, after less than 15 minutes, the Swedish forces broke through. The Swedes, who were expertly trained at hand-to-hand combat, charged their Saxon counterparts with swords and did not fire a single shot. In spite of being under constant fire, the ferocious Carolean onslaught forced the Saxons to retreat towards the village of Bezen. The Swedish wings had even more success, as the numerically inferior Saxon cavalry began fleeing after just several minutes of fighting. Only a handful of cavalry on the Saxon right, led by Colonel Kospot, mounted a desperate defence. However, they were surrounded and broken after the rest of their wing fell. The Swedish right afterwards came upon the 6,000 Russian soldiers. The Russians had their uniforms turned inside out, as Schulenburg knew that they were inexperienced and Reinschild would target them. Their weakness was revealed though. The Russians fired only one volley at the Swedes before throwing down their arms and retreating behind the wall of spikes. After removing the chevaux de frise there, Reinschild chased down the entire Russian force and massacred them all. As all of the Saxon cavalry had fled, their Swedish counterparts were now free to surround the remainder of the army on all sides. Much like Hannibal almost 2 millennia before him, Reinschild executed a double envelopment perfectly, forcing the remainder of the Saxon army to surrender. And with that, the entire Saxon army, raised with so much toil, care and expense, and which was twice the size of the Swedish army, had been defeated in less than an hour's time.
Wow.
The Saxons lost more than 7,000 men during the battle itself, and had almost all of the rest imprisoned, with the total losses amounting to about 15,000 to 16,000. The Swedes lost around 400 men and also had around 1,000 men injured. Augustus's biggest problem, however, was that the road to Saxony now lay wide open and undefended. Augustus, who linked up with Brausa and had 12,000 men at his disposal, was only 80 kilometers away from Fraustadt when the battle took place. Shocked at the news of his grand army's complete defeat at the hands of an inferior Swedish force, Augustus hastily retreated to Krakow. Since Peter the Great was unwilling to send his army to even relieve the siege of Grodno, there wasn't any hope of Russian aid for them either. After his victory at Grodno, Charles XII turned west to prepare for the upcoming invasion of Saxony. In the next few months, Augustus desperately tried to negotiate a peace with Charles, even offering to split up the Commonwealth between himself and Stanislav. As autumn began, the Swedish armies marched into Saxony and quickly occupied Leipzig. Without any other options, Augustus agreed to all Swedish demands and signed the Treaty of Eltronstadt. According to the treaty, he would renounce all of his claims to the Polish and Lithuanian crowns, annul treaties with Russia, and extradite the Swedish traitor Johann Patkull. In order to humiliate his personal enemy, Charles also forced Augustus to congratulate Stanislav on his victory and coronation. In the aftermath of defeating Polish-Saxon forces and signing the Treaty of Eltronstadt in October, Charles did not leave Saxony immediately, instead choosing to settle down for winter. This was primarily done so the Swedish army could rest following 6 years of nearly constant campaigning. It also served the purpose of pressuring the Saxons into gathering the war indemnities as quickly as possible. The treaty itself was not immediately signed by Augustus, as he was still in Poland with Peter.
Augustus was still in Poland after the Treaty of and even participated in a battle against Swedes, the Battle of Calais. At last, he was forced to return to Saxony when Charles revealed the treaty publicly. Okay.
Tsar terrified Augustus, so much so that the Elector of Saxony did not dare tell him of his unconditional surrender. Augustus was indeed stuck between a rock and a hard place. He was forced to accompany Menshikov and the new Russian army, which Peter had sent to Poland. At the same time, he knew that facing a Swedish army in battle after surrendering would not be taken lightly by Charles. In fact, during the very signing of the treaty, Augustus was on the march from Lithuania to Lublin because Menshikov intended to fight a Swedish army in western Poland. That Swedish army, led by Mardefelt, received a letter of warning from Augustus about his situation and what Menshikov's goals were. Mardefelt, still uninformed about the signing of the Treaty of Eltronstadt, thought that it was another ruse by Augustus and did the contrary of what the Elector had asked him to do. Mardefelt was initially hesitant to face Menshikov in battle due to the Allied army's size. Alas, he was encouraged by the Voivode of Kiev, Józef Potocki, who said that the Polish soldiers would fight to the last drop of blood, and decided to march towards the Allies' position at Kalisz. The Swedish-Polish army found an advantageous position between the villages of Dobrezes and Kozelnavich and arrayed in battle formation. Menshikov's army formed up across from them. Mardefelt had around 4,000 men under his command, with another 9,000 to 10,000 Polish allies under Potocki. On the other hand, Menshikov had over twice as many men: 5,000 Saxons, 9,000 Russians, 4,000 to 8,000 Cossacks and Kalmyks, and another 7,000 troops belonging to the Sandomierz Confederation. The Swedish soldiers were placed in the center, while the Polish cavalry was on the flanks. Meanwhile, Menshikov placed his own Polish troops in the center and the Russian and Saxon forces on the flanks. However, he also left a cavalry contingent on the far left side for flanking purposes. Both sides had between 10 and 15 guns, although it is unknown whether they were of any significance to the battle. The battle commenced on the 29th of October between 3 and 4 p.m. Wanting to prove Mardafelt wrong for implying that the Polish were cowards who avoided battle, Potocki led his cavalry on a massive charge towards Menshikov's line. At the first charge, after only several minutes of fighting, Potocki's troops started fleeing, with some of them even retreating behind a wagon fort. The Swedish troops, now left alone against a massive army, prepared for the inevitable. Menshikov's entire army fell upon the 4,000 Swedes. Nevertheless, neither Mardafelt nor his troops would break as easily as their Polish allies did. During the fighting, both sides lost a lot of their cavalry units. The Swedish forces were slowly defeated, and in a last-ditch effort, Mardafelt formed a hollow square with whatever troops he could rally and held on until late into the night. Those troops stopped fighting and surrendered only after their enemies stopped attacking first. In fact, some sources claim that Mardafelt...
Wow! They finally just gave up attacking and the other side just decided to give up. Wow. They were in it for the long haul, weren't they?
Felt's men held out longer than the Polish forces behind the wagon fort. In the end, the Swedish-Polish army lost almost 5,000 men, over 2,000 of which were imprisoned, while the Allied army suffered around 3,000 casualties. As a result of this battle, Greater Poland, the only part of the Commonwealth left under Charles and his allies' control, was left undefended. Menshikov was unable to capitalize on this, however, as Augustus retreated to Warsaw and left his troops in Krakow. To smooth things over with Charles, Augustus took as many Swedish prisoners as he could and released them when he was able to do so. Still petrified at the thought of Peter's reaction to his unconditional surrender, Augustus waited until the dead of winter to leave for Saxony. Peter was enraged after learning of the Saxon capitulation because he knew that his position in Poland was hanging by a thread. The Russian army retreated across the Vistula and destroyed all of the bridges on the river, hoping to slow down the inevitable Swedish advance. Left without any proper allies, Peter tried to keep the Polish resistance against the Swedes alive by all means. At first, he tried to bribe and threaten the Polish nobility into not acknowledging Stanisław as king. With Poland devastated by the civil war, the vast majority of the magnates refused to fight the Swedes even if they did not support Stanisław. Having failed to rally the magnates to his side diplomatically, the Russians started brutally raiding the Polish and Lithuanian countryside, and they also besieged the important port of Gdansk. The siege was easily repelled, and military pressure proved to be impractical, as now Peter was just making more enemies. As a final desperate measure to keep the war in the Commonwealth alive, the Tsar sent an envoy to Pope Clement XI. He promised to work on reuniting the Catholic and Orthodox churches if the Holy See denounced Stanisław as king. Whether his intentions were sincere or not is unknown, though the talks broke down quickly regardless.
Hey, before you take out another credit card or loan, did you know you could get up to $500 cash per month by switching to solar energy, totally for free?
Without allies, and with the Russian army exhausted by war, Peter went to great lengths to make peace with Charles. He even offered to return all of the conquered lands except for St. Petersburg and the forts along the Neva. The ambitious Charles XII was confident in victory, however, and said to his commanders, "Gentlemen, I have resolved never to make an unjust war, but to end a just one only with the utter ruin of my enemies. I will attack the first to take the field, conquer him, and then deal with the others." Hampered by the constant arrival of foreign diplomats, the slow arrival of reinforcements, and by Augustus himself, the Swedish forces only left Saxony in the autumn of 1707. At the end of the year, Charles crossed the Vistula with his army. Peter, who was celebrating Christmas in Moscow, left for Grodno immediately after hearing of the Swedish advance. He did not stay there for long, as the city was an easy target for the unified Swedish army. Incidentally, Charles entered the city 3 days after Peter left it. During his retreat to Vilnius, Peter ordered his Cossacks and Kalmyks to ravage the countryside and burn everything that the Swedish army could use. This strategy left the Swedish army with a chronic lack of supplies. Facing starvation, they took the last supplies that the peasants had, even further devastating the area. Meanwhile, Peter grew ill in early 1708, leaving all military affairs to his generals. Ill health struck him when he was facing the worst internal disorder of his reign, the Don Cossack revolt led by Bulavin. News of Peter's failing health, as well as the revolt, made the Russian army fall into disorder. Men were deserting at an alarming rate, and morale was low. The generals were also bogged down in Mahilov, as they could not agree on whether the war should be continued with Sweden. Furthermore, 32,000 men also had to be detached from the main army in order to quell Bulavin's revolt. It was anyone's guess which way Charles would go from Grodno, into Livonia or towards St. Petersburg, towards Moscow or into Ukraine. At first, he left Grodno in a northeasterly direction. Petrified at the thought of losing his new capital, Peter ordered St. Petersburg to be additionally fortified. After forcing the city of Vilnius to resupply the army, Charles turned towards the southeast and encamped at Minsk. While there, General Leeuwenhaupt informed Charles that his army in Livonia was ready to march south and support the main army. In the following weeks, some Swedish and Russian forces exchanged fire on the outskirts of the city. This incident made Charles aware of the poor state of the Russian army. Seeing this as a perfect opportunity, Charles decided to attack the Russians at Mahilov and then directly advance towards Moscow. The Tsar ordered his generals to hold the defensive line around Mahilov at all costs, as Moscow could be easily assaulted from there. Capitalizing on the disorder within the Russian armies due to recent events, Charles sent a small diversionary force under Sparre to Borisov in order to stall Goltz and his 8,000 men. The main Swedish force arrived at Bereza-Sapieska on the 25th of June and immediately started working on crossing the rivers and marshes in front of them. By the time Goltz realized what was happening, Charles was already halfway to Mahilov. Utterly surprised by the speed at which the Swedish army crossed such difficult terrain, Sheremetev and Menshikov left to form a defensive line at Holovchin.
I'm going to go ahead and end this here. Knocked out those two parts. There's obviously a battle's coming up, and I don't want to stop in the middle of it. So, I'm going to end this here. Get some stretches in. Oh, I'm going to go eat. I know you really want to know that. So, you have to like and subscribe, or I just set your house on fire. Have a good day, have a good night.